Last time on the Idea Review, I spoke to Christian Weaver, who is a barrister who had written a book called The Law in 60 Seconds. It's a guide to the most interesting and common areas of British law. At that time, I said that it was one of the most important books I'd ever read. But more recently, I've been spending a lot of time with this, A Fatherless People by Dele Ogun. And this is a story about, as far as I'm concerned, it's a history of Nigeria. He calls it the secret story of how the Nigerians missed the road to the promised land. We're going to be going into this and we're going to be discussing the rise and fall of nations, military coups, and the international context of how a nation is created. And also the idea of self-determination and how people forge a story for themselves. Dele is a commercial lawyer and writer, he's also known as Mr. Specsavers, and he's put together this fantastic work. And without further ado, I'm going to get started. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Demi, for inviting me.
Of course. So I just want to get straight into this. For a lot of us of the younger generation, we haven't had a lot of us haven't even read a comprehensive history of Nigeria. So it's really important for us to understand where we come from, but we need the context. That's why I was really glad to find this, and I was really glad to read it. So thank you is the first thing to say. Thank you for writing such a thing and for making it actually accessible for readers. I want to start with the people on the front. So on the cover of the book, we have Uthman Danfodio, Samuel Ajayi Crowther, Sheikh Al-Kanemi, and then in the middle we have George Goldie, Frederick Lugard, and Robertson. On the bottom we have Babangida, Obasanjo, and Abacha. The first question is, why have you chosen these 9 people to represent the book? Because as far as I'm concerned, you've said A Fatherless People, but you've kind of shown us who the fathers are.
Yes, good question. There are actually 3 phases there. That's why they're arranged. You've got a religious phase at the beginning. Danfodio represents the northwest of Nigeria. Remember the jihad of 1804? So that's Islam coming in from the northwest area. You've got Ajayi Crowther represents the advent of Christianity. This was the era of the missionaries. So you've got the 2 religious forces coming in. And as regards El-Kanemi, that represents the Kanuri people of the northeast of Nigeria. They had Islam before the Danfodio factor and influence. In fact, there was an issue, you will have come across it in the book, where basically the Kanuris are rejecting the Fulani claim of special religious Islamic embassy. They said, well, we had Islam before you did, so this jihad of yours, we see through it as just a power grab. So that's a religious phase. If you're thinking about the construction of Nigeria, phase 1. Phase 2 is the military. So you have Goldie, who's going around the country and conquering established political orders, regimes, kingdoms, etc., and putting before them a standard form treaty of protection, so-called protection, I should say, putting it with a gun to their heads, sign this and or else. You then have Lugard, who consolidates that phase. Lugard comes in around the 1900s when Nigeria is now being constructed, and he's the one that's given charge of the amalgamation, which was a key event in Nigeria's history in 1914. So if you imagine this house of Nigeria being constructed, you've got the religious phase, underpinning it, and then you've got this conquest phase, the amalgamation being effected by Lugard, and then you have Robertson, the last colonial governor of Nigeria. He's there because that was the jump off stage where they're supposed to have granted independence, or we were supposed to have won independence. But as you see in the book, he plays a very significant influence in terms of the Nigeria we had now, because he was the one who rigged the political arrangement, the independence arrangement that we're supposed to be running with. He was the one who rigged or supervised the rigging of the elections in a way to put the North in power. And we see that being manifested even to this day. So that's a legacy. Then you come to the local agents. Again, the military. You have IBB, Ibrahim Babangida. He's there because he was the one who was responsible for the abortion of the June 12th presidential elections, when Moshood Abiola won the elections.
That's 93?
That was 83.
83.
June 12th, 83. He won the elections. And sorry, June 12th, 93.
Okay.
You're quite correct. Won the elections. The mandate was not honored. The elections were aborted, and it's thrown us into crisis ever since. Then came Abacha, who eventually pushed Babangida aside and took direct military rule of the place until he was mysteriously eliminated from the political stage. You will have seen that in the closing discussions in the book. And then you have Obasanjo, who is the one who, almost as a sop or to mollify the South and the Southwest, following the abortion of the June 12th elections, he was the one that they handpicked, they being the North, handpicked him to restart the game in 1999. So those are each of these characters represents and captures some of the issues that we are still struggling with. The religious tension between Islam and Christianity, the colonial influence, the direct colonial influence in terms of the rigging of elections and the legacy of corruption. This was all brought in by the colonials. And then the local surrogates who have continued the show thereafter. So they're not fathers in a way. It doesn't contradict the title, A Fatherless People. These were just the if you like, the ones who rendered us fatherless.
Okay.
These are the ones who, because we had fathers.
Right.
Each of the nations, each of the 371 nations had established political orders, which was serving us, as all peoples do. It was serving us well. In order for them to construct their Nigeria, they had to uproot what was there. Mm-hmm. And that included the knocking off the political leaders. So in that process, you render the peoples fatherless. So the structures that they have, you effectively decapitate it.
Okay.
You dig up the roots, and then you're left with that scenario of Nigerians who have missed the road to the promised land.
Okay, thank you. I think when I was looking at it, I look at the two phases 1 and 2 together. I look at Abacha, Babangida, and Obasanjo as the children of the first two phases. So Nigeria as a child of A, religious conquest and expansion, and B, colonial administration and organization. So is it any surprise that you get despots like we see at the bottom when you see who their fathers are in terms of a Nigerian context?
You're absolutely correct. The first two phases are the what I call the digging up and the conquest, because the faith factor was a big part of the process of controlling that space. Christianity was brought in purposefully to achieve that end, because we had our own faiths, we had our own belief systems. And when you're going to colonize a peoples, it starts from control of the thinking process. And so you get them locked into the faith that's coming in from outside, one coming in from the east, the other coming in from the west. And then as you say, the offshoots of that, the local offshoot, are characters like Babangida, Obasanjo, and Abacha. These are the ones who are specially selected. They've been profiled very carefully to make sure that they will play the game. And the result is what we have.
I noticed that a number of the colonial officers had parentage who were missionaries as well.
Yes.
So that kind of takes me into what I want to say about the timeline, because you constructed a timeline in this book of Nigeria within, like, not just chronologically, but also internationally. So you get to see the creation of Nigeria as other events are kind of happening in the world. And it's really good because you then get to compare them and you get to see, kind of try and like piece together how certain things move, kind of the American situation, the British situation, and so on. There was one thing that jumped out to me, and it's right at the start of the chronology. In 1787, William Wilberforce founds the abolition of the slave trade parliamentary committee. The next year, there's the society founded for exploration into the interior parts of Africa. I found that really interesting, and I'm like, it kind of shows the relationship that kind of Britain had with Nigeria. As soon as there's an imprint on the conscience that maybe, we need to stop the slave trade, it's like, how can we still explore, right? And that's really useful. And then obviously 10 years later, you get the Missionary Society founded. So I'm sure that jumped out to you as well, kind of constructing it.
Without question.
Yeah.
You see, one of the points that I wanted to bring out in the book, in the early part of the book, was to this narrative about the reasons for abolition of the slave trade. We were sold a narrative, and they have sold the narrative to their people, that there was a moral turnaround.
Right.
And what I wanted to show was that there was nothing of the sort, because if there had been a moral turnaround, a realization, a dawning that slavery is evil and we should not be doing this to these people, how comes colonization followed immediately on the back of it?
Right.
So you move from one evil to arguably a greater evil, because the slave trade, you're taking individuals out. Colonization, you are capturing the generations, not just the immediate generation. You are effectively enslaving them in your ways, with a view to extracting their resources, etc. So you will have seen the explanation, the real explanation for abolition, which was the loss of America. Mm-hmm. So that's when you make the point about how I position events in the wider global context. You see that the loss of America was 1776. Mm-hmm. And it was at that point that slave trade no longer being sustainable, because they had used African troops in the War of Independence.
Right.
They couldn't get enough of their own troops across the oceans. So they appealed to the enslaved in Americas, fight for us. When we win, we'll free you. And the Americans on their side matched the bargain and said, look, fight for us. When we win, we'll free you. So you now have a new generation of Africans who have training and experience in the use of weaponry, who have been killing whites, as it were. At that point, the slave trade becomes difficult to sustain. And plus, of course, you had the events in Haiti, where the Africans of Haiti, again, they got their experience from the American War of Independence when they went back to Haiti. That's what inspired the revolution and overthrew effectively brought slavery to an end when what's our fellow? I've forgotten his name for a moment.
Dessalines.
Yes. No.
Toussaint.
That comes Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture. When he effectively abolished the slavery in Haiti. So you got these things taking place, but they're always thinking long term. What's the next phase? What's the next move? We can't take them out any longer, but the resources are there. So you'll find that Sierra Leone was colonized as early as 1807. 1808 was the colonization of Sierra Leone. 1807 was the formal abolition of the slave trade.
Okay.
You can see the timeline
right
there. And Sierra Leone then becomes the launch pad for the wider penetration of West Africa. And as I said in the book, the agenda was to create one huge colony.
Right, yes.
Probably would have been called British West Africa or something like that.
Yeah.
A bit like South Africa.
Yeah.
You know, it's the geographical space that was being seized.
Yeah.
It only, that agenda was only deflected by the competing demands on that territorial space of the French principally, and also the Germans at a later stage.
Yes, it would have been like India. It would have been a giant West African colony from, the Atlantic coast, Sierra Leone and Mali, all the way, kind of up to Sudan.
Correct.
Roughly. That's very interesting. And I think you pointed out that having kind of an administrative body that size kind of brings up its own problems. And one of the things as well I got from the book is that the British had practice. I think one of Nigeria's problems was that the British had kind of perfected this and were kind of learning how to effectively manage a colonial program. They had lost America. They didn't want to lose another one. India kind of was going in the 40s and 50s. And to what extent would you say it was true that kind of Nigeria is the jewel in the African kind of colonial crown? Because I think about this idea, Nigerians used to say giant of Africa, and I don't think they say it anymore. I think it's something that's kind of died down over the last few years, while Nigerians have really got to grips with what they're facing as a state. But it seems to me like that idea of Nigeria being a giant of Africa may itself be a colonial idea.
It is.
Okay.
It was flattery.
Right.
It was designed to make us feel good about ourselves.
Okay.
Giant of Africa. Well, you feel as if you are the dominant force. Whereas the reality, the reality is that you're too big to be effective. And it certainly worked from the perspective of the colonizers. If you have one giant territory, you will have seen in the early parts of the book where we list the 371 ethnic groups. Rather than having 371 separate administrations, you have the single one. That works from the perspective of the controller. One set of laws, a smaller group of colonizers and administrators, if you like. But from the perspective of the 371 ethnic groups with their own languages, all being treated as one, without respect for their individual histories, their value systems. So from the perspective of the colonizer, Giant of Africa works beautifully.
Right.
But from the perspective of those who are within that giant net, this is what causes all the conflicts and the killings that we hear of systematically. A very recent example was that poor young girl, Deborah Emmanuel, that was stoned and for an innocuous remark on a chat group. This is the risks that Nigerians have been exposed to as a result of them all being thrown into the one net.
Okay, and it was a recent study that put together those 371. I think before they were saying 354 or so.
We used to go around saying 200, 250.
Okay, right.
In fact,
so it's a lack of information.
The reality is that nobody actually knows how many we are. We don't know the head counts in terms of the population figures. We don't know to the last detail how many ethnic groups there actually are in that space. When we produced the lists, or when that list came out of the 371 ethnic groups, somebody, Matthew Cooker, I think it was, that piped up and said, my group is not in there. Reverend Matthew Cooker piped up and said, my group is not in there. So it goes to show that even at this point, we still don't know.
Okay. I know you said something in an interview about arranging being part of a group that was working a constitution. Can you talk about what you think let's say a constitution was written today for Nigeria, about what you think should be in that constitution that provides for all those different ethnic groups?
Yes, the group that I'm the coordinator for is called the Fatherland Group.
Okay.
Derives from fatherless, hence we all have the concept of the fatherland, those 371 ethnic groups. The constitutional model that we are promoting, that I've been pushing, is one that gives each and every one of those ethnic groups their proper place in the sun, if you like. How do you achieve that? It's something similar to what they have in the European Union. If you think about the European Union, you have a German running Germany, a Frenchman, Macron, running France, and an Italian running Italy. And yet, at the larger level, you have a president of the European Union. So it's not beyond the conception of human beings to be able to fashion a constitution which effectively allows each of the 371 ethnic groups to run their own affairs at the lower level. And whereas at the union level, you then have what we have to do in common, which is what is best done at the collective level. The language that I use to describe that is the orange union, because if you peel the orange,
right? Yes, the orange and the apple.
Yes, you have this skin of the orange, which represents the unity. That's what bonds us. That's what wraps us together. But underneath that skin, you have the segments, which are distinguishable, and they all slot comfortably side by side and make the whole. That is, in graphic terms, the constitutional model that we've been pushing for Nigeria, as distinct from what we've been running with, which is, I call that the apple. You peel the skin of the apple, and there you see one indistinguishable mass underneath. In theory, that's possible. You could crush the individual identities, which has been the agenda that we've been running with. Crush the individual identities, get us all English-speaking, destroy all our languages, destroy all our ethnic varieties, etc., variations, wipe all that out. But it's going to take something like what the Americans did to the native Indians,
right?
Because you have to wipe the slate clean, effectively. And is that really what Nigerians want? They love being Igbos, they love being Ijaw, they love being Yoruba, they love being Hausa. So the constitutional model we're proposing is one that allows them to be what they are, and just sharing what needs to be shared at the upper level.
There's this chap called King Dosumu. He is one of the coastal authorities, and politics comes into play, and he ends up going to surrender Lagos to the British, and he gets aboard this ship called the Prometheus, and he makes this declaration of sovereignty and says, for the British, he says, essentially, we're giving you this land in perpetuity, in whole and total command, and so on and so forth. And I had a look at that and I thought, okay, the first thing I thought was Prometheus. That's a Greek name and it has a connotation of trickster. The second thing was that when you're dealing in matters of sovereignty, you need to have it reversed. So I noticed that Nigerians never got the same thing from the British. Nigerians never got a British prime minister who came to Lagos or who came to Abuja and says, we are now kind of giving you this land back in perpetuity and in total sovereignty. That isn't what happened. Nigeria got a collection of kind of constitutions, which we'll come to. But I wonder whether that is what is actually needed, a kind of a wholesale recognition of a transfer back of sovereignty.
Yeah, interesting point. When you look at that treaty, you're a lawyer as I am. When you look at that treaty, you said it was clearly drafted by somebody from the Inns of Court in England.
Right.
Dosunmu is not literate in that language, and so it's drafted to divest and vest in the British all those rights that he himself didn't have in the first instance.
Mm-hmm.
The second point is this, that when they were acquiring these treaty rights, they were acquiring them from the individual kings of the territories. The sovereignty, if you can argue that sovereignty was surrendered by that treaty, it was surrendered by King Dosunmu in relation to that particular territory to the British. By the time they leaving, they're not returning the sovereignty to the individual places. It's all been meshed and pooled now, and the whole the whole geographical space is now handed over, lock, stock, and barrel. Now handed over to the local surrogates, as I described them. The important detail to bear in mind is this: the British had a formula that they were running with. Offshore islands like Lagos were part of the template of colonization. So if you think about Hong Kong in relation to mainland China, if you think about Cape Town in relation to South Africa, Gibraltar in relation to Spain, the target was always to find that offshore space, and Lagos under Dosunmu was that place. Conflicts and proxy wars were then stimulated and sponsored in order to get to the position where these treaties were then being signed with the British authorities. Luckily, we have a proxy war right before us in Ukraine at the moment, so we can see what it looks like, where the weaponry, you're not doing the fighting yourself, but you supply the weaponry in order for the fight to be conducted with your political objective in mind. This is exactly how Lagos was lost and ceded by Dosunmu, because local conflicts were being sponsored and promoted from behind the scenes. But as you say, the sovereignty was taken from the individual kings. It's said that in all, Goldie ended up signing about 400 different treaties.
Right. But why do you think that was necessary? If you have the military supremacy, why go through the rigmarole of having these people sign treaties?
Because it was part of the narrative. The narrative is always very important in explaining what's going on, that we're not conquistadors going in and simply conquering them, which is actually what really happened, but to give it the semblance of they asked us, they invited us to take over. That's what the treaties of protection represented. So it's drafted in terms that, I've taken full account of our interests, my own interests, and the interests of my people. And I, King Dosumu, hereby freely and willingly hand over the sovereignty of my land to the British authorities. So it was a cover.
This is one thing I like about law. One of my favorite parts of law is consumer protection. So you have UCTA, the Unfair Contract Terms Act, and you also have the Consumer Protection Act. Mm-hmm. Essentially, what they say is that there are rules about how companies govern themselves and how they interact with their customers. Just because a company says no returns or whatever the condition is, doesn't mean that it's actually legally valid, right? So there has to be a sense of fairness, right? It means that the government has said, like, overarching about a contract between, a company and an individual, there may be a kind of a power imbalance, but the government has legislated to say that there are still fundamental principles of fairness which have to apply. Mm-hmm. And in the case of King Dosumu and the British or the other kind of protection contracts or treaties, we didn't have that. There was no overarching, although there was in terms of the peremptory laws and international laws, they weren't being observed by kind of the parties who were in play at the time.
Hell no. Hell no. As I said, it was a camouflage.
Yeah.
It was, those treaties of protection were really there as documentary proof of title to be produced
property
to other European powers.
Right.
It was not really a document to regulate the relationship between the peoples of the territory and the British. It was more to be able to show the French, for example, look,
this is ours.
This is ours. We've got to treat it with them. Because the scramble was all about grabbing as much territory as you could. How else do you demonstrate possession of a territory? The easiest way to demonstrate it is by documents, by these so-called treaties of protection. So that's essentially what they were.
Right. And you pointed out that the Berlin Conference wasn't, strictly speaking, where the partitions of Africa took place, but more so setting the table in terms of the rules by which the game was to be played. The rules
of the game, yeah.
Right. And one of these rules was, if you got the paper, then that's first claim.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then after a while, paper claims were not sufficient. This is them regulating the carve up between themselves. They got to the point where they said paper claims are not sufficient. You've got to demonstrate effective possession. So you've got to have the boots on the ground, as it were. And that's what led to some of the clashes or the near clashes between the French and the British in particular.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting that there didn't seem to be a outright war between the British and the French in West Africa, but I think we'll come to that. And I think the French did some tacit support for the Biafran cause. But what I want to ask you about is the religious question. So the religious question, as we've seen, Nigeria is kind of the product of the colonial administration, but also the religious effect. Islam coming primarily through jihads from the north, and Christianity coming primarily through missionaries from abroad. How should Nigerians feel about practicing these religions? That's the question. Obviously, many Nigerians are at least nominally Christian and nominally Muslim. How does one address that issue, that doublethink? How does a Nigerian move forward with that?
Well, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with our people following those faiths. people have their belief systems and they have their way of relating to God, their creator, by whatever name they choose to call him or know him. So the problem is not the religions per se. The problem is the political dimension.
Okay.
And when you consider the fact that at the point of the amalgamation, 1914, where predominantly Islamic northern Nigeria was amalgamated with predominantly Christian southern Nigeria, at that very point that was done by the British, they were having a crisis in Ireland between the Protestants of Ulster and the Catholics of Eyre, the Republic of Ireland. Same timeline. In actual fact, it was August 1913 that the King George V, the then King of England, effectively summoned his Prime Minister to Buckingham Palace because he was concerned about the imminent breakout of civil war between the Protestants of Ulster and the Catholics. Both sides had armed up. Why? Because the Protestants did not want to come under the rule or the governance of Catholics, whereas the Catholics on their side were saying, we're not prepared to divide Ireland. If we're having home rule, it's got to apply to the whole of Ireland. So you could see that religious standoff at a political level. It was exactly 8 weeks later that the same King George V signed the Edict of Amalgamation.
Okay.
Amalgamating the Christian South with the Islamic North. So the problem is not the following of the faith, as it were, by the individuals. The problem is the deliberate politicization of faith by creating these unworkable alliances, unworkable mergers of people with diametrically opposed religious values. And it was cynical because, as I said, they had the Ireland precedent right there before them. They knew, as we lawyers say, what's foreseeable. Was it reasonably foreseeable that such an amalgamation would give rise to troubles, conflict, bloodshed? It was clearly foreseeable because they had an immediate precedent right next to them in their own space.
And I think that's part of the problem, which is the lack of knowledge of colonial history, essentially. In terms of learning about Ireland, I don't think there's much of that going on in school. And even about kind of the other colonial projects from like a colonial perspective. But surely I can make the argument that once you have religions introduced in the way they were introduced in Nigeria, the religions themselves are now political, and the religions cannot then be extracted from the political context in which they exist. For instance, you have examples around the world of people using religions for their own political social movements. In the Nigerian context, how do you extract? Is it possible to really extract them politically? Because I know a lot of the activist types have decided to essentially move away from both kind of the major religions for the sake of being completely independent. And obviously one cannot be completely independent without also being independent in a religious sense. Like, that's part of one's independence. How do you feel about that? Is it practicable?
I'm not sure it is. I mean, because bear in mind when you consider also that the very low levels of education
Right.
amongst the critical mass of the people. It's very difficult to sort of filter and expect them to filter the purely religious from the if you like, the identity issues. They hold on to these faiths, and they hold on to them very, very strongly. We were always a spiritual people,
Right.
and this is what they saw when they strategized to infuse and inject these foreign faiths into the system. So we are where we are. All you can do at the political level is to try and neutralize and make an arrangement that contains the political spillover from the faith dimension. So consistent with the Orange Union analogy, if you have, as they ultimately ended up doing in Ireland, you had a separate government for the Protestants of Ulster, and separate from the government for the Republic of Ireland. That's how you do it. So there are ways of containing the problem, managing the problem, but I don't think one can realistically expect our people to give up those faiths. With education, but even some of, I say that with some hesitation, because many of the, even amongst the educated, you're finding them following pastors coming out with all sorts of claims to have spoken with God and that and the other. And these are educated people.
Yeah.
So it's not just an education thing or formal education.
Right.
It's much more political education, awareness. To some extent, if you, through books like this, you can help people to understand where these influences came from, then they're able to sort of contextualize it to a greater degree. Because if they never knew how Christianity was brought in and why it was brought in, if they never knew why the jihad happened, and that the reality was the jihad was really, it wasn't something spiritual, it was actually just land grab, as I said, illustrated by the fact that El Kanemi in northeast Nigeria of the Kanuris said, what are you talking about? We were Muslims before you came along. So that can help to some degree when people understand situation, but that's only going to affect a small minority of the people.
Yeah, because the people who were able to go to school in the early days, it was tied to, I mean, in the South, it was tied to kind of their own missionary schools.
Correct.
And obviously there's a lot of mention about some of the characters who come later on in the North going to Barewa College. Yeah. So the kind of the idea of religions is tied into education and then political education and so on. Do you think in today's context, do you think religious leaders should be held more to account about their about the activities that they're doing in Nigeria, about social activism and so on?
Well, there's a lot of anybody who has influence over great numbers of people, especially when they're using the name of God or the Creator, that comes with responsibility. And it's the absence of responsibility, of any sense of responsibility, that's been the problem in the Nigeria space. As I said, you have so-called men of God setting the precedent. Just imagine that if those men of God were speaking truth to power each and every week.
Absolutely.
They have the opportunity, they have the congregations there. If they were really empowering the people with knowledge, it'll be a very different Nigeria. But of course, they wouldn't do that. What they've become like the local agents of the power structure again. So, like as in the book, we've got the local soldiers.
Yeah,
you can all, if a new edition was produced, you could almost produce the new men of God in there as part of the tools, because if they were teaching truth, if they were preaching the gospel, the radical gospel, as Christ himself preached the radical gospel, they will be in trouble with the authorities much more than they are now. But you can see that there's no tension between the men of God and
Right.
the power establishment.
Right. The vice president is a pastor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very comfortable.
Yeah. Speaking of sovereignty and this idea of a religious order, in 1903, when the British overcame the Fulani in northern Nigeria, essentially they assured them that the religious order would remain in place. That's not a promise they made in southern Nigeria, and obviously it wasn't. Plainly. That's a difference, and I think that comes to kind of the issues that you just mentioned when it comes to the amalgamation. You're kind of you're trying to Appleize, if I can coin that.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to Appleize, two very different groups, even culturally. And even to say there were two groups is arguable, because obviously you have so many different ethnic groups and cultures as well. So I think that's something that was really good, that was highlighted, is kind of like this difference. And then the problem comes when you just try and put things together. That doesn't make sense. So again, international context, all of this is going on. So we get to about 1914, and the British decide, for administrative purposes, let's put this together. But so you keep going, and the rest of the world is watching. So the kind of European powers are looking at each other doing this. President Roosevelt essentially told the British that you guys can't continue doing this. And what we want to have is a UN order. Or what you're supposed to do now is you are now supposed to be responsible for these colonies in a different way. Can you tell us about that interesting tweak of events?
Yeah. Well, first of all, going back to the amalgamation and the plugging the two very diverse faiths together, an important detail that probably doesn't come out in the book, because it'll probably come out in the next edition, was that what we call the Sharia territories, the upper north of Nigeria, that was brought in as a result of a treaty, 1898, between the French and the British. There was a swap. They swapped. The British released their territorial claims in Madagascar.
Okay.
So they released their territorial claims in Madagascar, such that the French had the whole of Madagascar, in return for the British taking that Sharia strip, Kano, Sokoto. That's how that strip came into the Nigeria space.
Okay. So initially it wasn't part of Nigeria.
It wasn't part of the Niger territories, as it were. So it was this special deal. And you ask yourself, why are you bringing that in? It's the case that I'm making is that it was done precisely to embed that religious conflict.
Okay.
As we saw in Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics. So you've acquired that strip of territory, knowing that that's a purely Islamic area, and you've gone out of your way to strike a deal to swap land in Madagascar for that space, because ultimately that's going to be your instrument of control of the whole of the wider Nigeria territory. We then roll forward to the Second World War and the Roosevelt dimension. Again, this is the importance of situating events in Nigeria within the wider global context. because the narrative we were sold was that just like the slave trade and slavery, there was a moral turnaround. We just realized it was wrong. Similarly, the narrative that was being sold was that we just realized colonization was wrong. And remember, they talk about the winds of change, Harold Macmillan's speech, winds of change blowing through Africa. Whereas the real story is what I've brought out in the book, that it was actually the Americans, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who called time on empire. And he was able to do that because he knew, as they did as well, that the First World War and the Second World War were all about the colonies. It was a war between the haves and the have-nots.
And it was known that Hitler wanted a world empire.
Hitler wanted a world empire. Because when they looked around, if you think about it, if somebody's getting subsidies and cheap resources from one, and you're supposed to be in competition, you'll be out of business before long if you don't equalize the subsidy that your competitor is getting. And so the Second World War being basically unfinished business, because the colonies that Germany had initially, Cameroon, Togo, at the end of the First World War, those were confiscated from Germany.
Yes.
And partitioned as trust properties between the British and the French. So when Hitler comes onto the stage, he wants the colonies back, and he doesn't just want those colonies, he wants more land. We haven't got enough land as far as he's concerned. So this is what Roosevelt is saying, and America is saying. But there's also a self-interest dimension, because of course the Americans see the opportunity for them to emerge now as the big players on the international stage, with the rest of Europe consumed with this war, and the Churchill appealing to the Americans to come in on the side of Britain in the Second World War against the Nazis. There's the opportunity to exercise influence. And what Franklin Delano Roosevelt effectively did was to say, well, the price of us coming in on your side is that the colonies have got to go. You can't continue this arrangement where you're basically exploiting these territories and putting nothing in there. So that was the real background to decolonization. The unfortunate thing, though, is that Roosevelt then dies something like 2 weeks before the end of the Second World War. So his vision of the new world that he was looking to secure falls by the wayside. And because as soon as he leaves the stage, the war comes to an end. And the next thing, we've got the Cold War.
Right.
And America is now distracted from the
decolonization
agenda.
Yeah.
Until later on, as I explained in the book, it was the Vietnam War that was the occasion by which the decolonization came back onto the agenda.
Right.
Because the Americans, Eisenhower in particular, felt let down by the British with his attitude was that we had saved you the First World War and the Second World War. We expected you to come in with us. As far as Vietnam was concerned, you left us in the mire.
Yes.
We had to go in alone. So, right, remember that decolonization thing? Now, get out of there. So that was the real story.
Okay. I think that was good. And I'm trying to, okay, so that was, okay, so you get those, so you get the grand picture of the world wars. So 100,000 Africans were deployed by the British to fight in World War II as well.
Yep.
In Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And you have African Americans being sent by America to fight in the same war. So you have people who could be second cousins, or who may have seen each other as cousins 100 years ago, now meeting each other in different contexts in like the jungle to kind of fight against unknown enemies. I thought that was a kind of ironic thing. And then there's a film called The Five Bloods by Spike Lee, and he's kind of touched on those points as well about, how white Americans saw black Americans who were dying for them, but then about how they also saw the Vietnamese, and then how the Vietnamese saw them, and then how the Vietnamese didn't differentiate between white and black Americans in terms of when they were fighting them, but the Vietnamese created propaganda to black Americans that said, look at how they're treating you at home, yet you're coming here to fight us for them. I thought that was some interesting irony there.
Well, the worst part of colonialism was this, that it was not just the material resources of another peoples that you were using, exploiting. It was also the manpower that you were exploiting,
right?
And particularly in wars. So the colonial armies, when the First World War and the Second World War happened, they're not going to send Englishmen in great numbers or Britons in great numbers to go and die in those wars. They're going to draw on their human resources in India, in Nigeria, and those ones are going to be given uniforms, and they're going to die in your wars. This is the worst aspect of the colonial experience. It was the opportunity. I made the point in the book that when you think back to the War of Independence, if you had enslaved people under your control, such that they are doing tasks that you would otherwise have to do without you having to pay them, the ultimate deployment of those same people is to go and die for you in your wars. So you don't have to go and serve in the front line. You're sending your enslaved to go and die in those wars. That's the worst aspect of colonialism.
So sad. And actually, I was quite kind of sad reading the whole book. I felt like it was like watching a car crash in slow motion. You can see, you know where it ends up is pretty grim, but to have to go through the details of it, it's kind of painful. How was it? How was the experience for you writing it?
I think you're always having to read grim accounts of grim events in the course of the sort of human history. When you're putting this kind of story together, it can be depressing reading because, as you say, you can see where it all leads to. But my objective was to position a new generation,
right,
with the understanding, because you can't solve a problem unless you understand it. And as you said at the beginning, it was a struggle to find books that tell the whole story. And so if it's not there, you've got to put it there. And my whole purpose was to enable your generation and generations afterwards to just be able to pick up one book that tells the story from beginning to end. When you're reading about the way your people are tricked and manipulated, and you can see what's going on, but they can't see what's going on. Bear in mind, they did not, the Dosumus, etc., who were signing the so-called treaties of protection, they did not have any insight into the outside world.
Right.
And whereas we're able to look back and we're able to see the trickery, see it all happening before our eyes. So yes, there's a side of it which can be depressing, but I think the reward is just the opportunity for a new generation to really understand their story.
It's crucial because we have lots of ideas about how to go about things. One of my uncles once said to me, "You guys can't really solve the problem because you don't even really understand it." And it's fair enough. I think lots of us have ideas and lots of energy about what can be done, but the context is important. And I want to pick up on something you just said there about the trickery. I was thinking about the 1951 Constitutional Conference. This is Nnamdi Azikiwe and the British and other aspects of other representatives from different parts of Nigeria coming together to talk about how Nigeria was going to be governed. Looking at it now, it looks like not just Zeke, because you're quite critical of Zeke, but looking at it now, it looks like all of the people who were the representatives of Nigerians in these times were naive. That's how it looks now as we look back on history. Like even at the point of where you get the Goldies, you get the kind of the coastal chiefs who had a suspicion of the British. I can't remember the name of one of them, who he refused to kind of enter the ship to kind of speak. They summoned him to a meeting and he said, I need some assurances before I go.
Yeah,
because
Jaja Ovokubo.
Right, okay. But when we get to 1951 and we get to the kind of more modern representatives, it seems very naive. And I think, why weren't they able to tell that something was afoot here? Do you think it was actually naivety, or do you think they were right to kind of take the British on face value?
Yes, hindsight is a wonderful thing. It can look as if they should have seen this. To some degree, they did know something was going on.
Okay.
But the information that's available is not the information we now have available. So, for example, the letter that was written by Balewa to Sherwood Smith, the last governor of northern Nigeria, where he says to him, obviously it's a confidential letter, says to him, tell us 10 things that we would need to protect our position in the north. We don't want to be dominated by these ones in the south. Draw up a list of 10 things we need. Then Sherwood Smith responds, again in confidence, you don't need 10 things. We've already given you 50% of the seats in the legislature. You just need control of the army and control of the police force. Now, Awolowo and Azikiwe were not privy to that communication. So how could they have known that these guys had been tipped off to say that the real power, forget all the grammar and speeches and the intellectual qualities of these Southerners, what really matters is control of the weaponry.
But they should have known that. I mean, it should have been obvious that whoever is in charge of the army is going to have, unbalanced power in the country.
I get that. Bear in mind what had also happened was this. The army was being shaped by the British.
Right.
They were the ones making the appointments as to majors in the army and recruitments, etc.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I think it's a key point that there was a meeting that took place about the NSAR situation in 2020. This was in Parliament. That came after the petition that was done. At that meeting, it was revealed that the Nigerian police were being trained by the British police, and that wasn't as part of kind of a humanitarian effort. It was a move that came out of the Foreign Office.
Yeah,
I found that really interesting. It was part of a diplomatic event rather than like a humanitarian project. But sorry,
exactly.
Yeah.
And another example is the BBC Hausa service. It's only recently that they've introduced a BBC Yoruba and BBC Igbo language service. But the BBC Hausa service was long-standing.
Okay.
And it was not a BBC initiative. It was actually funded by the Foreign Office.
Okay.
So
yeah,
if the players, the political actors on the ground, the Azikiwe, the Awolowos, the Enahoras, there's so much that they could know. But when key strategic moves are being taken by the British, who have all the experience. They know what they've done in India, what worked in India, what didn't work in India.
They had practice.
They've got their precedents that they just pull off the shelf. And at the same time, these nationalists, there was a tendency on their part to just want to get the British out as quickly as possible. You just want to say, you just go, we'll deal with the problems afterwards.
Right.
Such that I remember one point when there was talk about the creation of new states in the eastern region. And they gave them the option of saying, either we postpone independence. The only way we can create new states, we have to postpone independence. But if you want independence now, then we can't deal with that. And in those circumstances, the nationalists said, well, you go. Because you almost just want freedom. You want a white man out of your space. So there was a little bit of the emotional in that would have caused them to go for the quicker solutions or our apparent solutions, which is often set up as a trap, because the British could have done those things before independence, i.e. the creation of new states. And as I said in the book, because they're the ones who put everybody together, they had the moral authority to create new states in a way that post-independence, the new leaders wouldn't have the same, they couldn't claim the same objectivity. It would always be used as a power play as to where you're going to create the states or not. So naivety, yes and no. It's all a function of, they were up against tough odds. Even at those constitutional conferences, the rooms were bugged.
Okay.
All their mail was being opened.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And such that there was nothing that they could
speak to each other about and plan.
It was all out there.
Okay.
Where they were going next.
Yeah.
The Mavericks were already waiting for them and knew how to position.
Okay.
And then also in that environment, there are always weaker characters that can be turned to and used. If the main characters are proven stubborn, they can be undermined. This is how you had a crisis between Awolowo and Akintola.
Right, yes, this Akintola character.
Yes, Akintola wanted, he wanted office, he wanted power, whereas Awolowo was a different, deeper kind of character, more principle-led, more philosophical. And whereas Awolowo said, look, we can't ally with the North. Our natural alliance is with the East. Akintola was more ready to go into that alliance with the North. It's similar to Tinubu in the present times. Ally with the North because they will empower me, and you sell the short term for the long term.
Right.
So there are many factors like that.
Talk to us about the cross carpeting. Is that 1956?
Yes. Well, there are many myths in the Nigeria story.
Okay.
Propaganda is a key part of the political play, and the story of the allegation that Azikiwe and the NCNC won the elections for the control of the Western region and were only deprived of power by Yorubas as a tribal reaction.
Okay, yes. Can I explain the way I heard the story? Mm-hmm. So I heard the story that, not from the book, but how I've heard from outside. Essentially, the Zeke's party, NCNC, yes. Essentially they took the Eastern region, which was the base. They campaigned in the Western region and they won most of that. But the people in the West didn't understand it, because the people in the West didn't campaign in the East. That was the action group. Mm-hmm. So they didn't campaign in the group. So they thought, one party's for one region. Essentially, or that was the feeling. When they discovered that voting for the NCNC meant having Zeke in the West as the premier, that was the issue, and they said, okay, we don't want this. We didn't really understand elections enough to be sophisticated enough. And then they said, okay, this is not what we want. And then comes the issue. That's the way. How does that tally?
Yes, well, a key part of the Nigerian political play has been the Punch and Judy scenario between the East and the West.
Right.
Always quarreling, always fighting each other. And a key part of that, and this was deliberate by the British, stemming from what I call the ultimate April Fool's joke, when on 1st of April 1939, they divided what was southern Nigeria into eastern region and western region.
Oh, it was the 1st of April.
1st of April, yeah. 1st of April 1939. Without being asked to do so, there was no crisis between east and west.
Yeah.
Just divided the south, eastern region, western region, and left a much larger north as one block. That was done in order to create this stage for this knocking of heads between the Igbos and the Yorubas together. And the cross-carpeting allegation was part of that narrative and part of that game and part of that propaganda. So yes, NCNC was the party of the East. Action Group was the party of the West. And the expectation, as NPC was the party of the North, the expectation was that each would stay in their own zone, as it were. NCNC having control, unchallenged control of the East, is then competing for seats and office and power in the Western region. The story goes, as you explained it, that they won. And it was the realization that an Igbo person, Azikwe, would be governor of the Western region that now led the Yorubas to cross carpet. That's how the story goes, but it's untrue.
Okay.
As I explain in the book, that when you actually analyze the detail of the candidates, NCNC won Lagos, which is very different from the Western region.
Right, yes.
Undoubtedly, they were the strongest party in Lagos. They won those seats. But the others who ultimately formed and joined with the Action Group were not NCNC candidates.
Okay.
There were the Ibadan Party, for example. There were many of them stood as independents. And when you even looked at Azikwe's own accounts, he doesn't go so far as to claim that these were NCNC members.
Okay.
He points to those who were sympathizers and those who had worked with the NCNC, and he expected them to fly the NCNC flag. But no, the cross-carpeting was part of those propaganda pieces, a bit like the Igbo coup narrative.
Right, 66.
A falsehood, yeah, a falsehood. But it's the lies that are used to sustain the political order. And once the lies are thrown out, it's very difficult to erase them.
Right,
It's very difficult to get away with it. They keep repeating the propaganda.
So, okay, so we're trying to create this state called Nigeria. We've got the Eastern region, we've got the Western region, we've got the Northern region, and we've got the parties kind of participating in elections. Ghana gets independence in 58.
57.
57.
Mm-hmm.
And India?
India, 49.
Okay, so India had already gone.
Mm-hmm.
So we jump forward. Abacha, who's one of the people on the front, one of the 9, and he's come up with a statement. He's just taken office, or physically taken office, and he says, "This regime will be firm, humane, and decisive. We will not condone nor tolerate any act of indiscipline. Any attempt to test our resolve will be decisively dealt with." And that's what he says when he annuls the result of the election, that MK Abiola won. What that reminded me of was the tweet that Buhari sent out in 2021 or 2020? I forget. He made a statement that we're going to deal with people in the language that they understand. He's threatened the Nigerian people not to make too much noise. That statement was promptly deleted by Twitter. And I just thought maybe the significance of that is really key. It means, Nigerians all knew what it meant, coming from a kind of military leader, or former military leader. But the fact that an outsider looked at what you said to your countrymen and deemed it unacceptable in a public forum is significant. And probably it would have been the same if Abacha was on Twitter today. What did you think of that?
Well, the reality of governance in Nigeria is that it's a product of, it's governance by arms. It is not a democracy that we're running. We've never really operated a democracy. Behind the facade of elections, going back to that letter between Sherwood Smith and
Balewa,
what you really need is control of the weapons, control of the army and control of the police. That is the basis of governance in Nigeria, where the state, whether in the form of Buhari when he was a out and out military ruler, or now a military ruler just wearing civilian clothes, but the reality is still the same form of governance. It is that a scenario in which the civilians are completely disempowered.
Right.
They have no means of defending them, not even bows and arrows,
right,
to defend themselves against the excesses of the state. Before the British colonial experience, we had more ability to protect our rights. It's funny, isn't it, that now in 2022, Nigerians are much more vulnerable to the excesses of power than they were in the sort of 1700s. Because then, even if it's the crudest weapons, even if it's a bow and arrow, you had that to protect
you just
yourself.
pick it up and go. I remember something you mentioned about the winner takes all kind of mentality in Nigeria, and it reminded me of the first past the post system. In the Nigerian case, it means that you have large minorities of people who can just go for years, and just slide for years, no representation, no kind of means of, expressing their disapproval with the government. And you just have that, just periods of 10, 15 years where people don't feel like they have a voice. That's really difficult. That's really difficult to fathom.
It is that the impunity that arises from a monopoly of violence by the state actors as against the those who they govern that makes all the corruption possible, all the abuses of civic rights, and makes possible those kind of statements where you are threatening your people. And you're able to do that because you know that you have a monopoly of the weaponry.
Right.
If you knew, the gun laws in America are a matter of controversy, but government cannot act with impunity.
Right.
When they know that the citizens have firearms. They don't have to be the most sophisticated of firearms, but you conduct yourself with due respect to the fact that if you push them too far, they do have a means of
responding.
Of responding.
Right.
And so Abacha's statements, Buhari's tweets, it's all part of that. It's the colonial arrangement still continuing.
That's what it feels like.
Just as the British, when they were there, they had a monopoly of weaponry and such that they could do whatever they liked, take resources without any sense of accountability. That is just continued. The form of it is just changed, but the substance remains the same.
Julius Caesar has a line which says, "There is a tide in the events of men, which, if taken at the flood, leads on to fortune." And I remembered that when I saw the title of the book, The Missed Road to the Promised Land, i.e., there was a way to get to the promised land. Like, some kind of promised land exists somewhere. Obviously, it's been missed. And I think it's pretty clear reading the book that when you take the right decision at the right time, it can push you in the right direction. If you need to get a train somewhere that comes once an hour, if you miss that train, you're going to be at least an hour late, and longer if you have to get other connections and so on and so forth. So is there a single point that you can point to as the point that Nigerians themselves more so missed that road? For me, it's 1993. And how now can we get to the promised land?
For me, it's 1993 to 1999.
Okay.
And if I had to pinpoint it, it would be the 1999 so-called elections.
Obasanjo.
Yeah. Why? Because we had them on the back foot at that point. And the position that had been taken by the Movement for National Reformation that was led by Chief Anthony Anaho and the pro-NACO groups, pro-National Conference, that's what it stood for. The position that they had taken was that we're not going to participate in any elections until we see the Constitution.
Right.
That was the line that everybody has been asked to hold. But again, because they're always flawed characters, if the principled ones take a stand, they're always flawed characters that are available that you can then approach, that the establishment can approach, to say, never mind those ones, you come with us. And those flawed characters, they broke the ranks. They agreed to participate in that 1999 election without seeing the Constitution.
That's it. That's a big one.
Because they needed, democracy needs legitimization by the people coming out and participating. The ultimate power that the people have is say, we're not coming. We're not going to participate. And at that point, they could have, we had the opportunity of securing a new constitutional settlement along the lines of the Orange Union. But we missed that opportunity. It was traded in. And the ultimate beneficiaries were the Obasanjos who got the appearance of power because they were now enjoying themselves as president, and all the other hangers-on. But that was a key mystery. And we're back there again now because the 1999 Constitution is now widely acknowledged as a fraud.
Right, it is.
It contains the declaration, we the people give ourselves this Constitution. But it's a bit like those treaties of protection that we started with, drafted by one side and just imposed. Nobody knows who drafted the 1999 Constitution. So it was a diktat. It has now crashed once more. And we're now at that point of a fresh start. So we're back to the crossroads once more. And it then becomes an issue of, are we going to go for the again, the shortcut, the cheap solution, or we're going to stand our ground and say, this needs to be dealt with once and for all.
Okay.
We're not going back to that scenario again.
And I think potentially 66 and 67 was an issue, obviously, with the Biafra as well. That was a very significant point. I just want to ask you for any final comment on where we are today in terms of upcoming presidential elections, NSAS, and your call to the younger Nigerian generation. How do we get out of this mess in particular?
Well, where we are now, we're ironically, it's today they're supposed to be having their the primaries.
But they suspended it. Yeah.
In fact, the PDP one is today.
Okay.
Is the ruling party, the APC, that pushed theirs to the 5th. But you can see the comedy that's going on. It's become apparent already. The game is that there will be a Fulani to Fulani succession. So you have 371 ethnic groups. You have a Fulani man, Buhari, who's been running the show for the last 8 years and has crashed the vessel wearing the colours of the APC. So what do? They cross over to PDP.
Yeah.
Most of their significant players have moved across to the PDP because there are no issues locking them to each other. These are not issues-based parties. These are just personalities. And the plan is that, all right, we've soiled the sheets over here with the APC. Now,
right,
let's go back to PDP. And they've positioned another Fulani man, Atiku, to become the flag bearer, presidential flag bearer for that party. So the rest of us are towed along in this game of fools, whereby this card trick, one Fulani leaves the stage, another Fulani appears on stage, and that's supposed to be democracy.
Right.
And they've, what I'm hearing is that they are positioning Goodluck Jonathan, who was PDP president before Buhari. They're positioning him to go and take over the APC from Buhari. So can you see the new generation,
right?
Your generation can see that it's a sham.
Yeah.
Fraud can only produce fraud.
Okay.
When you have an illegitimate constitution, document masquerading as constitution,
right,
it can only produce shams and further shams. And what we're faced with now is a charade. We are playing democracy, but not practicing democracy. And it's become almost cynical.
Yeah.
Again, linking it with the NSAS, that was deliberately done to terrorize the civilians. Just say, don't challenge us. Don't test us. A bit like the Abacha statement again. Again, the rule of the gun, ultimately. So whatever we do, just swallow it. What the new generation, and I think the diaspora in particular, have a big role in this. They need to get the understanding of the Nigeria story.
Okay.
You've got to separate truth from fiction. You've got to separate the facts from the false narratives. When you get the understanding, you position yourself to be able to move forward, to find a way forward. But if you're trapped by the false narratives of Igbo coup and cross-carpeting, if you get locked into those false narratives, then you just perpetuate the existing nonsense. But if a critical mass can be built up through discussions like this, awareness, then there's a possibility that we can take the right turning at the next junction and get back on the road to the promised land.
This is quite beautiful. A Fatherless People is available on deleogun.com.
Yes, and on Amazon.
And on Amazon also. So thank you very much, everyone. Make sure you get it. I think it's crucial for any young Nigerian. I think it's crucial. I think it should be studied in school. I think maybe secondary schools and the university level. I think it's a crucial book for everyone. So definitely promoting it. Any last comments?
Only to say thank you, Danny. It's
course.
these discussions are opportunities to raise the awareness. It's an urgent task. I've tried to make it easier for the ones coming behind. I read over 70 books in order to put that together. They only need to read the one book.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So they have no excuse.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks,
and all the best with the book. We'll put the details in the video and everything as well.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks.